I am 77 years old. My name is Sam Wu. In 1972, I was sitting in the third row of a martial arts exhibition in a gym outside Los Angeles, the kind of event where young fighters came to spar in front of coaches and scouts and a few hundred people who loved the sport enough to drive out on a Saturday for it. I did not know that night I would watch a 22-year-old Swedish karate fighter call out Bruce Lee in front of everyone there. I did not know Bruce had come in undercover, sitting in the back trying not to be noticed with Chuck Norris next to him. And I definitely did not know that what happened 5 seconds after Bruce finally agreed to fight would not even be the most shocking part of that night. What happened after is the part nobody talks about. I am going to tell you everything I saw.
The gym was nothing special. A converted warehouse in the San Fernando Valley with a few hundred folding chairs set up around 2 mats, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of sweat and rosin and old wood. This was not a famous tournament. It was a regional exhibition, the kind of event that happened every few months back then, where young fighters from different schools came to test themselves against each other in front of a crowd that actually knew what they were watching. I went because my cousin trained at one of the schools competing that night. I was 26 years old, working a warehouse job during the week, and Saturday nights like this were the closest thing I had to entertainment. I had no idea that night would still be sitting in my head 53 years later. Bruce Lee had a habit by 1972 of showing up to events like this without telling anyone he was coming. He was famous by then, not the way he would become famous after Enter the Dragon released the next year, but famous enough that if people knew he was in the building, the whole night would have stopped being about the young fighters and started being about him. He didn't want that. He told a friend once, and this got repeated to me years later by someone who knew him, that he liked watching young fighters develop without the weight of his presence changing how they fought. He wanted to see them as they actually were. So he came in through a side door an hour before the event started. Dark jacket, sunglasses he took off once he was inside, sat in the back corner where the lighting was worst and most people weren't looking. Chuck Norris came with him. The two of them had trained together for years by that point, and Chuck had told him about this particular exhibition, said there were some promising kids worth watching. I noticed them about 20 minutes in. I was 3 rows from the front, close to the mats, but I had turned around at one point looking for my cousin's coach, and that's when I saw him. Bruce Lee, sitting in the back like he was just another guy who showed up to watch some sparring. Chuck next to him, baseball cap pulled low, the two of them talking quietly between matches. I didn't say anything to anybody. I just kept watching him out of the corner of my eye for the rest of the night, which is probably why I remember everything that happened as clearly as I do. The fighter who changed that night was a young Swede named Dolph Lundgren, 22 years old, somewhere around 6'4", built like someone who had been training since he was a teenager and never stopped. He was visiting California that year, training with some American instructors, picking up everything he could before heading back to Europe. He had a reputation already in certain circles: strong striker, full contact background, the kind of fighter who hit harder than anyone his age had any business hitting. That night he went through 3 matches and won all 3. Not close wins. The first one ended in under a minute with a kick that folded his opponent in half. The second one went a little longer but ended the same way, a clean strike that put the other guy on the mat looking up at the lights wondering what happened. The third match was against the best fighter at the event, a kid who'd been training since he was 8, and Dolph put him down with a combination so fast that half the crowd, including me, didn't fully register what had happened until the kid was already on the ground. By the time the third match ended, the room had shifted. People who'd come to watch a casual exhibition were now watching something else. There was a kind of electricity building, the feeling you get when you're in a room with someone who is clearly operating on a different level than everyone around them, and everyone in that room knows it. Dolph stood in the middle of the mat after the third win, chest heaving, sweat dripping off him, and he looked genuinely pleased with himself. He had every right to be. What he'd done that night was impressive by any measure. And that's when somebody in the front row, one of the other coaches, made a comment that I think changed the entire direction of the evening. He said something like, loud enough for people nearby to hear, "Kid's got more talent than anyone in this building, maybe more than half the names you'd recognize." It wasn't meant as anything more than a compliment, but Dolph heard it. And Dolph, 22 and riding the high of 3 knockouts, decided to take it somewhere else. He turned to the crowd and said, "Is that supposed to mean something? Who am I supposed to be impressed by here?" People laughed a little, thinking he was joking, riding the adrenaline. He wasn't joking. He kept talking. Said he'd heard there were some real names in California, people everyone treated like they were untouchable. Said he'd like to see what all the talk was about. Said most of what he'd seen so far in America was overhyped. And then somebody, I never found out who, pointed toward the back of the room, toward Bruce. I felt my stomach drop. I looked back at Bruce and Chuck, and I could see Bruce's face change just slightly. Not anger. Something closer to mild irritation. The look of a man who came somewhere specifically to avoid this exact situation and watched it find him anyway. Dolph squinted toward the back of the room. He couldn't fully make out who was being pointed at from that distance under those lights. Someone near him said the name. Bruce Lee. The room got quiet in a particular way. Not silent, but the kind of quiet where you can feel 200 people all holding the same breath at the same time. Dolph laughed. A real laugh, not a nervous one. He said, "Bruce Lee is here? In this gym? Why would he be hiding in the back?" If you think that question alone was disrespectful, what he said about 30 seconds later made that look like nothing. He started walking toward the back of the room. Slow at first, almost casual, like he was strolling over to say hello to an old friend. But the way he was talking the whole time made it clear this wasn't a friendly walk. He said, loud enough for the whole room to hear now, that he'd watched some of Bruce's films. Said they were nicely put together, said the fighting in them looked good on camera. Then he said the part that made the whole room go tense. He said anybody could look fast when the other guy already knew where to fall down. A few people laughed nervously. Most people didn't laugh at all. Bruce didn't move. He sat there with his arms crossed, watching Dolph approach, his expression completely unreadable. Chuck leaned over and said something to him quietly. I couldn't hear what it was, but I saw Bruce shake his head slightly, like he was telling Chuck not to worry about it. Dolph stopped about 10 feet from where Bruce was sitting. He looked down at him. Because Dolph had a good 8 inches on Bruce, even sitting versus standing didn't change the height difference much, and he said, I came here tonight to test myself against real competition, and I keep hearing this name, Bruce Lee, like he's supposed to scare people. So here he is, hiding in the back of a gym. Bruce finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost bored. He said, I'm not hiding, I'm watching. There's a difference. Dolph said, watching or scared to get on the mat? The room made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, the sound people make when something has gotten more serious than they expected, and they don't know whether to take it seriously yet. Bruce said, I came here to watch young fighters develop, not to perform for a crowd. Dolph said, perform. That's a good word for what you do, isn't it? Performing. If you think that line was the worst thing he said that night, you have not heard what came 2 minutes later. Bruce stayed seated. He looked at Dolph for a long moment, and I want to be clear about what I saw on his face in that moment, because it matters for understanding everything that happened after. He wasn't angry. He looked almost amused, the way you'd look at a kid saying something he doesn't fully understand the weight of yet. He said, you won 3 fights tonight against fighters who aren't ready for someone your size and your speed. That's a good night. Go enjoy it. This should have ended it. A reasonable person would have taken that as a compliment wrapped around a polite dismissal and walked away satisfied. Dolph did not walk away. He said, I'd knock you out in 5 seconds. I really believe that. I think everyone in this room believes that. They just won't say it out loud because of who you are. The room went completely silent. Not murmuring silent. Dead silent. 200 people not breathing. I looked at Chuck. His jaw had tightened. I looked at Bruce. And for the first time that night, something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly. Something more focused. The look of a man recalculating a situation he'd already decided wasn't worth his time. Bruce said, 5 seconds is a specific number. Where does that come from? Dolph said, from the fact that you're small and I'm not. From the fact that everything I've seen from you is choreographed for a camera. From the fact that nobody in this building has ever actually seen you fight a real person who was actually trying to hurt you. Bruce was quiet for a moment. Then Dolph said something that crossed a line the whole room felt immediately. He said, maybe that's why you're hiding back here. Maybe you know what would happen if someone actually tried. The room reacted. A few people groaned. Someone near me said, under their breath, that's too far. Chuck stood up. I saw him start to say something, start to step between them, the way a friend does when things have gotten personal instead of just loud. But Bruce put a hand on his arm and Chuck stopped. Bruce stood up. He wasn't rushed about it. He stood the way he did everything, smooth and unhurried, like there was no version of this moment that required him to move faster than he wanted to move. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Dolph, who had several inches and probably 40-50 pounds on him, and he said, calm as anything, all right? That single word changed the temperature of the entire room. People who had been sitting started standing. People who had been near the exit started moving back toward the mats. Word was already spreading through the crowd, in that way it does. Faster than anyone could actually be talking, just a wave of people suddenly knowing the same thing at the same time. The promoter of the event, A guy named Hal, who ran the gym, came hustling over looking like he wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified. He said something about getting everyone to the mat, clearing space, making it official. Bruce told him this wasn't a match, wasn't for the record, wasn't anything except a young man who needed to learn something he wasn't going to learn any other way. Dolph was grinning. The kind of grin a man wears when he thinks he already knows how something is going to end. They walked to the center mat together. The crowd packed in around the edges, 3 and 4 deep in places, everyone craning to see. I pushed my way closer because I wasn't going to miss this from the back. Dolph took his stance. Full contact karate stance, weight balanced, hands up, the posture of a man who had spent years learning how to hit people as hard as humanly possible. Up close, his size was even more obvious. He looked like he could end most fights with a single connect. Bruce stood across from him, relaxed, hands loose, weight even, looking like he was about to have a conversation rather than a fight. Hal, not really sure what his job was at this point, said something like, "Begin," in a voice that cracked slightly. Dolph came forward immediately. No hesitation, no testing the distance first, just straight aggression, a front kick aimed to put Bruce on the back foot right away. It was fast, genuinely fast for a man his size. Bruce wasn't there when it landed. He'd shifted at an angle, not backward, just slightly off the line, and the kick passed through space that used to have Bruce standing in it. Before Dolph's foot was even back on the ground, Bruce had closed the distance. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe it. Bruce's hand came up and connected with Dolph's chest, not a full power strike, more of a controlled push delivered with enough speed and precision that it didn't matter how much muscle Dolph was carrying. The contact landed at exactly the moment Dolph's weight was committed, forward from the kick, his balance already compromised by the missed strike, and that single touch was enough to send all 200 and some pounds of him backward off his feet. Dolph hit the mat hard, flat on his back. The sound of it echoed through the gym. 5 seconds. That's roughly how long it took from the moment Hal said begin to the moment Dolph was on the ground, staring up at the ceiling. The same 5 seconds Dolph himself had bragged about 30 minutes earlier. The crowd erupted. Not cheering exactly, more like that collective gasp into noise sound a room makes when it just watched something it didn't fully believe, even while watching it happen. If you think that moment was the most shocking part of the night, what happened in the next 2 minutes will change your mind completely. Dolph lay there for a second, stunned, more from disbelief than pain. Then his face changed. Embarrassment turned to something uglier, something I could see building in him as he pushed himself up off the mat. He wasn't done, not even close. He got back to his feet fast, and instead of resetting into a stance, he just charged. No technique, no setup, just pure aggression, swinging wild and trying to close the distance with brute force since precision clearly hadn't worked. Bruce sidestepped him easily, and as Dolph stumbled past from his own momentum, Bruce's foot caught him behind the knee, a small sweep that folded Dolph's leg out from under him. He went down again, this time onto his hands and knees. The room got loud again, then quiet just as fast because Dolph was already getting up, and the look on his face had gone from embarrassed to something close to humiliated rage. He said something then that the whole front section heard clearly. He said, "You got lucky. Do it again, for real this time." Bruce hadn't moved from where he was standing. He said, "I have done it again. Twice now." Dolph's jaw clenched. He came forward a third time, slower now, more controlled, trying a real combination this time, a jab to set up a cross, trying to actually fight instead of just rushing. Bruce slipped the jab by rotating his shoulder a few inches. The cross never had room to land because Bruce was already inside Dolph's reach, too close for the punch to generate any force, and his palm connected with Dolph's shoulder with the same light, precise touch as before. Dolph's balance broke again. He didn't fall as hard this time, more of a stumble that he caught with one hand on the mat, but the result was the same. He had thrown his best technique, and it had done nothing. The room had gone from shocked to something quieter, something more like reverence. People who had walked in that night expecting a regular sparring exhibition were now watching something that felt like it belonged to a different category of event entirely. Dolph stood back up slowly. His chest was heaving now, not from exertion exactly, more from the adrenaline of 3 failed attempts and the growing realization that none of his strength or speed or training was finding any purchase against the man in front of him. He didn't charge a 4th time. He just stood there for a second, breathing hard, looking at Bruce like he was trying to solve something that wasn't adding up. Bruce said, quiet enough that only the people close to the mat could hear it clearly, "You're strong, you're fast, you've got real talent, more than most fighters I've seen your age, But you're trying to win this with force, and force only works if it lands somewhere. I'm not giving it anywhere to land." Dolph didn't say anything. His face had changed completely from the cocky grin at the start to something more uncertain, more like a young man realizing he'd walked into something much bigger than he understood. Bruce continued. He said, "Everything you know how to do, you've trained to do against people who fight the way you expect them to fight. The moment someone doesn't fight that way, all that training has nothing to grab onto." Dolph stood there, chest still rising and falling, and for the first time that whole night, he didn't have a response ready. Then, something happened that genuinely surprised everyone watching, including me. Dolph extended his hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't bow, didn't make a speech, just held his hand out the way you do when you're acknowledging something you don't fully have words for yet. Bruce shook it. The room applauded. Not wild cheering, more like the kind of applause that happens when a crowd has just watched something settle into place, something that needed to happen and finally did. Hal, looking relieved that nobody had actually gotten hurt in a way that would end his career running this gym, started talking about wrapping up the night's events, but nobody was really listening to him anymore. Most of the crowd was still focused on the two men standing in the middle of the mat. What happened after, away from the main crowd, is the part most people who tell this story never get to, because most people who tell this story weren't close enough to hear it. I was. I'd pushed my way near the edge of the mat during the match, and after it ended, I stayed close because I was trying to catch what Bruce might say next. Chuck had come over and put a hand on Dolph's shoulder, said something encouraging I couldn't quite hear. Dolph nodded, still catching his breath. Then Dolph said something to Bruce directly, quiet, just between the two of them, and I happened to be close enough to hear it. He said, "I meant what I said about the films. I still think there's a difference between that and this." Bruce nodded. He said, "There is a difference. Anyone who tells you there isn't is lying to you. But the difference isn't what you think it is." Dolph asked what he meant. Bruce said, "Choreography teaches you what looks good. Real training teaches you what works. The mistake people make is thinking those two things have to be opposites. They don't. You can learn from both if you're willing to actually learn instead of just deciding what you already believe before you've tested it." Dolph was quiet for a second. Then he said something I never forgot, something that told me this wasn't just a young man trying to save face after getting embarrassed in front of 200 people. He said, "I came here tonight to prove something to everyone watching. I think I ended up proving something to myself instead." Bruce said, "That's usually how it works." They talked a little longer, low enough that I lost most of it in the noise of the room clearing out, but I caught the end of it. Bruce told him that the speed and power he had were real, were rare even, and that most fighters never develop strength like that no matter how long they train. He said the only thing missing was patience, the ability to read what's actually happening instead of what you expect to happen, and that patience could be trained the same way strength could, just differently. Dolph thanked him, genuinely, not performing it for anyone watching, because by that point most of the crowd had moved on, heading for the exits, talking excitedly about what they'd just seen. I stayed a little longer than I should have, pretending to look for something I'd dropped, just so I could keep watching. Chuck and Bruce eventually left through the same side door they'd come in through, trying to slip out before too many people realized exactly who had been there all along. It didn't fully work. By the time they reached the parking lot, a small crowd had gathered, but Bruce handled it the way he handled everything that night, calm, polite, unhurried, like none of it bothered him in the slightest. I drove home that night replaying the whole thing over and over. I didn't tell many people about it for years, partly because nobody believed me when I tried, and partly because it felt like something that belonged to the people who were actually there, not something to be passed around like gossip. Dolph Lundgren went on, obviously, to become known for things that had nothing to do with that night in a converted warehouse gym in the valley. Movies, the kind of career that put his face on posters around the world. He never talked publicly about that exhibition, not in any interview I ever came across, and I've looked for it more than once over the years out of curiosity. Maybe he didn't want to relive getting put on the mat twice in front of 200 strangers. Or maybe, and this is what I actually believe, it was a private thing that mattered too much to turn into a story for cameras and reporters. Bruce Lee died less than a year later, July of 1973, 32 years old. I remember hearing the news and immediately thinking back to that night in the gym, the calm way he'd handled a young man who'd insulted him in front of a crowd, the patience in how he explained things afterward instead of just walking away having proven his point. It felt like such a small window into who he actually was, compared to the legend everybody else only knew from movie screens. I think about that night more than I think about most things from my 20s. Not because of the fight itself, though that part was unforgettable on its own. It's the part after, the quiet conversation at the edge of an emptying gym, that stuck with me the longest. A 22-year-old who'd said something cruel and reckless to a man he didn't really know, and a man who could have humiliated him completely, but chose instead to teach him something instead. That's the story. 53 years later, I'm still the only person I know who was close enough to hear how it really ended.